Today we're looking at the most searched questions on Google about, not surprisingly, Brexit. With me is Chris Beauchamp, IG Market Analyst. Let's get straight to it. We're doing the top 10 most searched questions today. First one, what and when is Brexit? Well, it was meant to be back in March. Now it's meant to be the end of October.
Brexit itself is the UK's exit from the European Union. I suppose it stands for British exit. I think the origin is probably lost. It was supposed to be back in March, and then in the way of things it got delayed. It now should happen on the 31st of October, which is Halloween, for those of us keeping track. In theory, though, it could well be delayed beyond that point. It depends whether we get any kind of deal or indeed a general election before then. But as things stand, that is when we're supposed to leave the European Union.
OK, what is the Brexit deal? Well, that's quite complex in itself to a certain extent as well.
Well, the one that exists, I suppose, is Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, which set out the measures by which the UK would leave. It also provided for what's called the backstop in case the UK deviated or attempted to deviate from the agreed rules of that exit, i.e. the transition period that exists for 2 years from the UK's official date would see it align itself relatively closely with the existing EU rules in order to provide the smoothness in that 2-year period, and then it would then allow the UK to begin to slowly diverge from the EU's rules.
Glad you mentioned the backstop, because that is one of the other most searched questions. What is the Brexit backstop? Effectively, it's an insurance policy, isn't it, in regards to the UK and EU and the Irish border? Yes.
The problem with the problem with the UK's exit from the EU is that it would mean there needs to be some kind of policing of the border in Ireland, because, of course, it would mean that the UK has a land border with the UK. In a sense, the land border would mean that goods could pass in and out of the EU and indeed the UK without being checked, and could therefore be goods that do not meet EU standards. So the backstop originally was designed just to include Northern Ireland, so that there would be no land border in the island of Ireland. But at the British request, it was expanded to include the UK. Now, the EU actually thinks the backstop's quite a good deal for the UK, because it mirrors many of the advantages offered by a single market and customs union. So they're quite keen for it not to go on too long. But the problem is the UK sees it as an unnecessary, or some in the UK see it as an unnecessary imposition of EU rules, and wouldn't allow the UK to set out and be this freebooting, buccaneering nation, making its own trade deals with all and sundry.
Talking of trade deals, we've got here now, not surprisingly, up in the top 10. What does a no-deal Brexit mean? Basically, UK immediately leaves the EU, single market, all of the above.
Exactly. The no deal would see the UK, in a sense, crash out of the European Union, if you like that kind of language, with no deal, no agreement over things like goods standards, services, regulations, flights, movement of persons, movement of goods, movement of labour. All these things that have been agreed over the past 40 years would suddenly drop out. And it would be the UK as if the UK had never been part of the EU at all. And then the idea on the sort of pro-no deal side is that it would then simply reset relations between the UK and the EU and allow a new set of negotiations to begin that would preserve the UK's integrity and also allow it to do whatever it wanted to do on the global stage.
And it would no longer contribute to the EU budget. That's around $9 billion as well, so that's also been discussed in terms of the divorce, as it were. Next most asked question is along those lines: what is a hard Brexit, also known as a clean Brexit, and very similar to a no-deal Brexit?
It is similar, I suppose, in most respects, but a hard Brexit technically might preserve some agreement with the EU. It might see the UK paying some of that £39 billion divorce bill, but a hard Brexit would essentially mean that the UK is entirely out of the single market, out of the customs union, beyond the jurisdiction of the ECJ, and would allow the UK to do whatever it wanted. I think it's mostly like a no-deal Brexit, but undoubtedly there would be perhaps a host of mini deals that would be passed to try and mitigate the impact of that sudden exit.
Next question, most searched on Google around Brexit is, what is a soft Brexit? I mean, that's seen as opposed to having the lowest impact on growth and on the UK as we disappear, well, as we separate from the EU.
Yeah, soft Brexit, I think, is to preserve some kind of close relationship, whether that's in the single market or in the customs union or both. Some would argue that a soft Brexit involves copying things like the Norway model that sees a close alignment in terms of regulation to some degree, also borrowing maybe from some agreements with Switzerland and others, in order to maybe keep the UK relatively close to the EU, to recognise that while it is leaving the EU, it still maintains close links in terms of defence and trade and cooperation.
Okay, next most searched question. What will happen to the pound after Brexit? Well, we've seen the volatility and we keep watching it very closely every time Johnson speaks, Corbyn speaks.
Well, like any other question related to Brexit, I suppose the answer is it depends. But people looking to trade sterling will want a more detailed answer than that. I think the assumption is that, say, a hard Brexit, a no-deal Brexit, call it what you will, would be negative for the pound because it would imply economic disruption. So I think it makes sense over the longer term, at least, to argue for that being a negative factor for sterling. On the flip side, a soft Brexit would be viewed as a positive because it would maintain those economic links and avoid disruption. You could argue that even in the even longer term, it could be positive for sterling, but I think the short-term view would say that a sudden exit would be negative for the pound. The problem is, of course, if that sudden exit is, if you like, well telegraphed, if we know it's coming in advance, it may not be as negative as people assume.
Okay. How will Brexit affect house prices? Well, we heard Mark Carney saying that a no-deal Brexit could see house prices tumble as much as 35%. A lot of people came back, that's way too pessimistic. We have seen house prices stall, haven't we, in terms of growth?
House price growth has stalled, but it hasn't gone into reverse, if you like. We live in a country where demand far outstrips supply, and that isn't going to change regardless of the Brexit deal we have, if one does indeed happen. I think it makes sense to argue that if a hard Brexit happens, if it hits consumer spending, if it hits wage growth, then you will see a moderation in growth of house prices, perhaps even they remain static or they decline in real terms over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. It depends how bad a no-deal Brexit may be. It may not be bad at all, it may be modestly bad. It's the kind of thing you only know with sort of 30, 40 years hindsight. I think, yes, it would probably hit house price growth, I think, whereas a soft Brexit, you can argue, you can clearly make the case, or it's easier to make the case, that it would be perhaps more beneficial for house prices. Going forward from that, I think it's much harder to tell and depends, again, on more fundamental factors, with Brexit being much more of a side issue, I think.
OK, we do have here what is happening with Brexit.
Well, this is a very definition of a fluid situation. At the moment, the UK is still expected to leave at the end of October. If we have an election before, then the result of that could see either that date honoured or the UK applying for an extension. At the moment, Parliament has tried to take no deal off the table to block the government from seeking a no deal. And it doesn't remove the possibility of no deal entirely, I think it has to be said. It could still happen either by accident, if you like, or the government could win an election and repeal that no deal bill. But certainly, you clearly see the division of the country, if you like, from that 52-48 result is reflected clearly in Parliament, with clear factions either pushing for no deal, for a soft Brexit, even the revival, amazingly, at this late stage of Theresa May's deal, or even pushing to try and get a second referendum. So that's where Brexit is at the moment. And I think, as you'd expect with such a major issue, it has been an event with so many moving parts that it's almost too hard to keep track of it at any one time.
You mentioned referendum there. That is one of the most top asked questions, and that is, could we see another referendum?
We could. I think there's always a body in Parliament that would push for a second referendum, and certainly a lot of people think another referendum is the best way to deal with this, because you can argue the longer the debate goes on in Parliament, the more time has passed since the last referendum. People have had a chance to change their views both ways, I would stress on that one. New voters will have arrived in the population with different views, and that could change the outlook. I'm not sure it would be a slam dunk, if you like, for Remain. Some people will have had their views hardened on that side. Other people will have had more strident views on just voting leave just to get out and get on with it. It still seems entirely possible, and it's one of those options in that Brexit flowchart we're all trying to keep in our heads at the moment. Certainly we could end up with another referendum, and that then begs the question of how will all the various parties campaign in such a referendum if it does take place. Thanks very much. Those are the most searched questions on Google around Brexit.
He's Chris Beauchamp, market analyst here at IG. As he said, it's still very fluid.